Hey, did you know that the mummy of the pharaoh who started one of pharaonic Egypt's most significant dynasties was lying unidentified in Canada and the USA for over a century, with absolutely no one aware of his true identity until relatively recently? And he's also the only pharaoh ever to have come to North America at all. So in this video, I'll share his story with you, the story of the fascinating life and afterlife of Pharaoh Ramesses I. Just as a bit of background info, I'll tell you about who this Ramses guy was in life. He wasn't actually born a royal or with the name Ramses, but he was born as one Paramessu to an elite troop commander named Seti, so he was relatively high ranking. But in other words, he almost certainly never expected to become pharaoh. By the way, Paramessu is just a variant of the name Ramses, which basically means the same thing. Re, i.e. the Egyptian sun god, has fashioned him. Paramessu grew up during the late 18th dynasty, i.e. the late 1300s BC, during the reign of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. He was a pretty bizarre pharaoh in that he fundamentally altered Egyptian religion by devoting himself to a single deity, the embodiment of the sun disk, Aten, instead of the traditional Egyptian pantheon. He also deliberately moved Egypt's capital to a city he built in the middle of nowhere and was either Tutankhamun's father or uncle, but I'll tell you all about that some other time. Back to Paramessu. After having presumably entered the army to follow in his father's footsteps, it's likely that he caught the eye of and was taken under the wing of a certain guy named Horemheb, a general who was likely Tutankhamun's designated heir before being shafted by one Eye, who was Tutankhamun's non-royal granduncle or grandfather. As I'm sure you can tell, the royal family at the time was painfully convoluted. But after 4 years, Eye died, and Horemheb, also a non-royal, took over as pharaoh. But before all this, when Horemheb was still just a high official, Paramessu seems to have become pretty close to him. He began a tomb for himself just north of Horemheb's massive tomb complex at Saqqara, the necropolis serving Egypt's historic capital, Memphis. In addition, Paramessu might even be mentioned in Horemheb's tomb, with one possible depiction of him bearing the same distinctive facial features which would become crucial in identifying his mummy in modern times. As pharaoh, Horemheb became his old army buddy's greatest benefactor and made him a vizier, a type of official equivalent to a prime minister, who was second only to the pharaoh himself. Horemheb was childless, but by this point Paramessu already had an adult son who had entered the army himself and was named Seti, the future Seti I, who himself had a young son that would go on to be one of Egypt's most famous pharaohs, Ramses II. But Seti and Ramses' mere existence was probably a crucial factor in Horemheb making Paramessu his heir, as Paramessu's reign would essentially be a stopgap between Horemheb and Seti I's reigns. Paramessu, now an old man, became pharaoh upon Horemheb's death, and with his accession, the 19th dynasty began. He then assumed the throne named Menpekti Re, translating to "Eternal is the strength of Re." Although this is the name his new subjects would have known him as, he also changed his birth name to Ramses. Unfortunately for him, however, his reign was very brief, likely lasting just 22 months or less between 1292 and 1290 BC, or sometime in the 1290s. Egyptian chronology is very confusing. He did do a few things during his brief reign, however. Like pretty much every pharaoh, he tried to appease various members of the Egyptian pantheon through an extensive building program. A stela in Brussels attests to him adding to a temple of Hathor in the Sinai, and he completed the second pylon of the Temple of Karnak in Thebes, the cult center of the god Amun, the most significant deity at the time. He also commissioned some buildings dedicated to the god Osiris in his cult center, Abydos, and to the gods Re-Horakti and Atum at their cult center, Heliopolis. A stela from the fortress of Buchen, deep in Nubia, also attests to him making endowments of food, priests, and even slaves to its temple of Ptah. It's also known that his son, Seti, played a very significant role in his administration and may have even been a co-regent or vizier. Either way, he did lead Ramses's armies out on campaign in the Levant, where he was maintaining stability in the region and restoring normal military and commercial operations amongst the small client kingdoms in the region. Luckily, he didn't have to worry about fighting the Hittite Empire just yet, as during Horemheb or Ramses' own reign, a peace treaty was signed between the two superpowers, but this would unfortunately change during Seti's own reign. But Ramses' time on the throne soon came to an end, and his son Seti, the new pharaoh, buried him in his small and unfinished yet beautifully decorated tomb in the Valley of the Kings, termed KV-16. Seti also built a small memorial chapel for him at Abydos, which was actually moved nearly in its entirety to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. You might think that's a bit weird, but that isn't even the only Egyptian building to have completely moved to the Met. Seti also dedicated a part of his own mortuary temple at Kurna to him. In a dedicatory stela Seti set up in the latter building, and in a truly rare glimpse of what was in the heads of these people, he reaches out from over 3,000 years ago and he gives us a truly touching description of his relationship with his father. He says things like, "He gave me his counsels as my safeguard, and his teachings was like a rampart in my heart, and I was with him like a star at his side." So now on to this great man's afterlife. Ramses's body was initially buried in a large, hastily decorated red granite sarcophagus, in addition to multiple gilded coffins that would have fit inside one another like Russian nesting dolls, although it seems these haven't survived. Although almost all of the funerary goods deposited with Ramses were looted from his tomb in antiquity, miraculously, some wooden statues stripped of the gilding they originally bore remained in the tomb until it was discovered by the Italian strongman, explorer, and redhead Giovanni Battista Belzoni. He discovered KV-16 all the way back in 1817, and since he was working under the British consul of Egypt, Henry Salt, these statues can now be found in the British Museum. But what wasn't found in the tomb was the reason it was built: Ramses himself. So I'll tell you what happened to him, and the bizarre story of how he ultimately got to Canada, my home and native land. You see, a couple centuries following Ramses' death, the glorious golden age in which he lived was coming to an end, and Egypt wasn't exactly in a great state. In fact, things got so bad that the royal tombs on the west bank of Thebes were being plundered of their treasures. So, in order to save the bodies of the great pharaohs of the past who lay in them, the Theban-based high priests of the god Amun began moving them out of their tombs and putting them together in tombs termed caches or caches. But let's not pretend they were doing this purely out of piety, especially given that they took everything valuable the mummies had on them and stripped off all the gold on their coffins. These high priests were totally free to do so because they were both closely related to and had become just as powerful as the nominal pharaohs of the 21st dynasty, the ruling dynasty at the time. The first of these caches to be discovered is referred to as DB320. It's a well-hidden tomb high up in the cliffs of Deir el-Bahri, where Hatshepsut's famous mortuary temple lies. Legend has it that a member of the local Abd el-Rasul family found it when one of their goats fell into it, and according to their testimony, that took place in 1871. Over the following years, they sold off various antiquities from it, which caught the eye of the fledgling Egyptian Antiquities Service, who busted and then tortured members of the family, resulting in the official discovery of the tomb in 1881. The royal mummies in it were then hastily shipped off to Cairo, but one royal was conspicuously absent, despite there being evidence of him having been there: Ramesses I. This evidence I speak of is this, a humble 21st dynasty coffin. We know that Ramses I's mummy was in this particular 21st dynasty coffin at one point because a fragment of it is inscribed with a little inscription claiming that on a particular day in the 10th regnal year of the reign of the pharaoh Siamun, Ramses I's body was removed from the magnificent tomb of his son, Seti I, and placed into the tomb of one Queen Inhapi, a mysterious location which still hasn't been conclusively identified. Ramses I's body was probably taken to KV-17 at the same time his grandson, Ramses II, was taken there in the 15th regnal year of the first pharaoh of the 21st dynasty. So 3 generations of pharaohs were reunited once more, although I imagine their reunion was rather quiet on account of them being, dried out corpses and all. And then, after they were all taken to the tomb of Inhapi, Ramses I likely moved to DB 320 at the same time as Seti I and Ramses II, sometime during the early 22nd dynasty. But after remaining together for pretty much 3,000 years, Ramses I's mummy would be spirited away to somewhere the ancient Egyptians had never even heard of: Canada. That's because the mummy that has been identified as Ramses I in modern times was sold to one James Douglas, an important Canadian-born copper mining engineer, in 1860. This is backed up by evidence from Douglas's journal linking him with one Mustafa Aga, a Turkish vice-consular agent who dealt in antiquities and worked with the Abdel Rasuls. Assuming the mummy we're speaking about is in fact Ramses I, this would mean the Abdel Rasuls actually discovered DB320 and took him away from it, but there's still good reason to believe the mummy we're talking about is in fact Ramses himself. Anyways, James Douglas sold the mummy to one Colonel Sidney Barnett, who had traveled with him to Egypt at least once a year later. Sidney Barnett happened to be the son of the founder of the Niagara Falls Museum, Thomas Barnett, so Sidney Barnett promptly installed the mummy in his father's museum. Strangely enough, some, including the museum itself, have claimed that it was Canada's and even North America's oldest museum, having been founded by Thomas Barnett in 1827. At points, the museum featured things like a 40-foot humpback whale skeleton, live animals, and even a Wild West show contemporary with the actual Wild West. The museum was forced to move shop to the American side of the falls in 1888, which all Canadian schoolchildren are taught is the worst side. Luckily, the museum moved back to the Canadian side at some point. There, the mummy of Ramses I would languish in obscurity for nearly a century, along with an assortment of other Egyptian mummies that had ended up in the Niagara Falls Museum. During that time, one of the other mummies with him was labeled as an entirely made-up wife of the aforementioned heretic pharaoh, Akhenaten, named Sepnesp. But even still, the mummy went ignored, except by gawking passers-by. That was until 1966, when, totally by chance, a German engineer on a business trip to Niagara Falls named Meinhard Hoffmann decided to take a look at the local museum. Given that the mummy was labeled as a wife of Akhenaten, and Hoffmann knew that Akhenaten's queen had been Nefertiti since the famous Nefertiti bust is housed in Berlin, he began thinking that it could actually be her. A decade later, he learnt that the mummies of queens customarily had their left arm crossed over their chest. He consulted the pictures he had from the museum, which showed that the mummy labeled as Akhenaten's wife didn't, in fact, exhibit that feature, but the mummy of Ramses did. He then compared its profile to that of the Nefertiti bust and became convinced that Ramses was actually Nefertiti. He then somehow persuaded a German television station to conduct and film a scientific examination of the mummy in 1985. Egyptologist Dr. Arne Egbrecht of Hildesheim analyzed the mummy and immediately found that he was in fact a man. After all, his loins had produced one of the greatest dynasties of all time. But they also noticed another very important feature of the mummy. His hands were crossed high above his chest, which was a position reserved for only pharaohs during the New Kingdom, the term used to refer to the golden age enjoyed under the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties. However, this arm position was used by commoners later in Egyptian history, especially during the Roman period. An expert on mummies, Wolfgang Paul of Tübingen, took hundreds of X-rays of the mummy and concluded that, since he found 2 masses in his chest, the mummy couldn't be a New Kingdom royal. Why? Well, you see, he assumed that they were the mummy's internal organs, and had been wrapped in linen and then stuffed back into his chest again, an embalming technique which was not employed during the New Kingdom. But that's not the end of the story. No siree. In 1991, Torontonian Egyptologist Dr. Gail Gibson happened to take another Egyptologist, Dr. Aidan Dodson, to the Niagara Falls Museum. He's both an expert in ancient Egyptian funerary customs and its political history, and he claims that as soon as he saw the mummy, he believed he was looking at a royal mummy. Anyways, Dr. Dodson thought he was looking at a pharaoh because Roman mummies aren't very high quality, and since the mummy he was looking at was, it suggested to him that he had instead been mummified during the New Kingdom, which of course would mean that his arms gave him away as a pharaoh. In order to see if this was true, in 1994, the owner of the Niagara Falls Museum allowed a researcher to date a small tissue sample from the mummy. The test produced a range between 1085 and 790 BC, which, although not contemporary with Ramses I, does prove that it can't be a high-quality Roman mummy. Besides, the techniques used to mummify him aren't consistent with what was done during the 20th dynasty, which is the final dynasty of the New Kingdom that does match with these dates, and radiocarbon dating can be rather finicky, so there's still a very high chance it's Ramses, but no one knows that yet. But soon the mummy would be in the hands of a Toronto-based private collector and art dealer named Billy Jameson, who bought the entire contents of the Niagara Falls Museum in the fall of 1998, and then, after consulting Gail Gibson, sold its Egyptian collection to the Michael C. Carlos Museum at Emory University in Atlanta in 1999, because its curator, another Egyptologist I quite liked named Peter Lacavara, wanted to expand the museum's fledgling collection. In his words, Ramses' mummy looked kind of sad, but also looked impressive. By this point, it had also been noticed that the mummy's visage is very similar to those of the known mummies of Ramses' son and grandson, Seti I and Ramses II. Most noticeably, they share a prominent hooked nose and a high forehead. Comparing the DNA of the mummy and Ramses I's descendants was considered, but since they'd have to play dentist with the royal mummies in Cairo and yank out some of their teeth, this option was dropped, given that it was deemed too destructive and dangerous. I don't know if that's still the case, but I haven't seen any mention of such DNA testing having occurred, so I'll assume that hasn't happened yet. But cranial facial measurements were made using X-rays, and they were very similar to those of Ramses' descendants. Most importantly, however, a CT scan confirmed that the mummy had been mummified with techniques employed in Ramses I's time. His organs were removed through a carefully made slit in the left abdomen and had been replaced with tightly rolled strips of linen, not organs wrapped up in linen. Thus, Wolfgang Paul's conclusions about him not being from the New Kingdom were dead wrong. Get it? Get it? The CT scan also revealed that his brain had been extracted via his nose, and that his cranial cavity was instead filled with a hardened ball of liquid resin. And I'm not sure if this was revealed as part of the CT scan or not, but one of Ramses' ears had been deformed, and this suggested he may have succumbed to a severe ear infection, possibly as a result of a botched piercing. Given all this evidence pointing towards the mummy I've been talking about being Ramses I, the museum at Emory concluded that he was, in fact, Ramses, and I'm inclined to agree with them. Some scholars, like Aidan Dodson, concur that he was a royal and lived at the same point in history as Ramses, but speculate that he could instead be Horemheb. Although this wouldn't explain his facial similarity to Seti I and Ramses II, let's take into consideration the fact that people have thought he was Nefertiti because of his face. Although maybe in life he was just a very hot man, you never know. But Ramses' 100-year-long stay in North America would soon come to an end after his true identity was revealed. Egypt requested his return, and the Michael C. Carlos Museum obliged. Ramses arrived in Cairo, and fittingly enough, he was mobbed by as many paparazzi as modern royals. On October the 26th, 2003, and by March the 9th, 2004, he became one of only 3 pharaohs that rest in the general area, in the general vicinity of where they were originally buried at Thebes. That's because he was moved to the Mummification Museum in Luxor, the modern name for ancient Thebes, on March 9th, 2004, where he is currently displayed as Ramses I. If you liked that video, make sure to subscribe, because there's plenty of videos like that coming up.